And now a brief history lesson. Historically, when you talk about monopolies, and in the context of this class, you can either say monopoly or you can say trust. The most famous trust story is the one about Standard Oil. The year is 1860 and the country is busy tearing itself apart and going to war against itself. A young man named John D. Rockefeller was sent out by his bosses to research the possibility of digging oil wells. He came back and advised against it, recommending instead the refining of the oil that was dragged out of the ground. His recommendation was round-filed, so he went and struck out on his own. Within 10 years, he incorporated the Standard Oil Company and was worth $1 million. Sorry. Rockefeller saw there were opportunities to grow his company, so first he bought up a lot of rail interests. That was the only way that Standard Oil would be able to be shipped. Then he went out to the competition and offered to buy them out, incorporating their facilities and workers, lock, stock, and barrel into Standard Oil. Within another 10 years, by 79, Rockefeller controlled 90 to 90% of the oil refineries and a big chunk of the railroad interest to get the oil from the fields to the refineries and from the refineries to the distributors. Now, in this year, seeing that the scattered business interests were difficult to manage across several states, he moved away from having a regular company into setting up a trust. Now, initially, a trust was a way for somebody to manage the property of somebody else, but Rockefeller used the trust to manage businesses centrally. The stockholders of these businesses signed their stocks over to the Board of Trustees of Standard Oil in exchange for getting issued a trust certificate. State laws protected against monopolies and restraints of trade, which Rockefeller did by buying up the Confederates. But national law at this point did not. Instead of trusts, Rockefeller went into the concept of a holding company. Now, a holding company is a company whose sole purpose is to manage the operation of other companies by holding a majority of voting stocks in those companies. Trusts, holding companies, and monopolies grew so big and powerful that Congress promised to do something about it. The chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, John Sherman, drafted legislation in 1890 that would seek to nationalize legislation to help bust up the trusts. The Sherman Antitrust Act said that any contract, combination, or conspiracy of restraint of trade is illegal, and it prohibited the establishment of monopolies in interstate or foreign commerce. Now remember, interstate commerce, that's going to come in handy later. This was a mostly symbolic move to begin with, spawning only 18 cases in the first 10 years. And it wasn't until 1914, under President Wilson, that some real teeth were given to the Sherman Act in the form of a strong federal trade commission. Now, the Sherman Act forbade creating monopolies in interstate commerce. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution gives Congress the express power to regulate interstate trade, and a bunch of Supreme Court cases, the first one being Gibbons v. Ogden in 1824, reinforced this power. Since the state laws were very patchworked and inconsistent from state to state, Rockefeller was able to manipulate the operations from state to state while barely staying on the right side of the law, while still monopolizing the industry. The biggest antitrust suit to come down the pike since Standard Oil was back in the 70s in the Bell telephone monopoly. Claiming that there was restraint of trade in the phone market, AT&T was forced to break up its holdings in the local call business, creating a bunch of smaller baby Bells. Pacific Telesis, Bell South, US West. This opened up the long-distance market to competition, but kept a lock on the local phone service. So you could choose whoever you wanted as your long-distance carrier, but if you want to make a local call, you had to use one of these companies. About 10 years later, there were efforts to open up the local market to competition, allowing long-distance carriers to provide local services. Well, guess who fought that tooth and nail? With the rise of cellular telephones and roaming charges and unlimited local and long-distance calling, this really now is moot except for people who actually have landlines. Just like the universe, those things that expand will eventually start to collapse. The AT&T Bell system was broken up into 8 baby bells, and through a series of mismanagement and mergers and stuff like that, it collapsed back in on itself to 4 different phone companies: Verizon, AT&T, CenturyLink, and Sprint and T-Mobile. The real interesting thing, though, was in response to the Y2K problem, the federal government put the antitrust laws aside. Now, the Y2K problem, back when computers programs were being written, space for the program itself was at a premium. So, in order to catch a shortcut, it was going to be a 2-digit day, 2-digit month, and 2-digit year, like 09, 21, 66, because they were still in the 1900s. What they realized in the late 1990s was that even though the space for programs had radically expanded, the result of writing all of these programs with a 2-digit year rather than a 4-digit year posed a problem. They were worried that the computers would see 1159 on 12/31/99. They would think that it was now 1900 rather than 2000. And they freaked out. They spent 2 or 3 years trying to figure out how to rewrite literally billions of lines of code. There were people who were disaster preppers. They were going to town. All of the things you see on the sideline of the Weekly World News were worried. I was at Disneyland for the odometer roll to January 2000, and Disneyland turned off all of their rides 15 minutes before midnight, just in case bad things happened. The interesting thing is, in October, there was a law passed that said companies could share Y2K data and giving them limited liability against antitrust lawsuits. You may be asking, what is the big deal? The question is, what's the problem? If a company can establish a monopoly in a marketplace, should they not be allowed to exercise that power? Well, in economics, we have to consider both cost and benefit as well as risk. The assumption is that in perfect competition, there are going to be several different factors working together to benefit the consumer. Through perfect competition, we're going to be able to assume the twin benefits of productive and allocative efficiency are going to occur. Productive efficiency is where goods and services are produced at the lowest possible marginal cost. It is being produced efficiently. Allocative efficiently is where the production is based on how many the consumers want. How many do they want? That's how many they're going to make. You're not going to run into shortages. You're not going to run into overages. But with monopolies, we have the assumption of contrived scarcity and inefficiency. Now, contrived scarcity is where producers produce less of a problem than they would have if they were in competition. So instead of having the machine spit out as many as they can, they're just going to turn it back down and they're going to produce few, creating a shortage. Static inefficiency counts on the law of supply to push the scarce items higher. X inefficiency is where there's no concern for the marginal cost of production because the costs are covered in the price of the item. If you want it, you're going to pay for it. You're going to pay the price that we set. And because monopolies have no competition, they're under no market pressure to continually improve their product. They don't feel the breath of the competitor on their neck, so they can comfortably sit and produce at their own pace. However, the monopolists say that they're not monopolists, and they argue that they're not a monopoly because they're not only competing with other manufacturers, but they're also competing with themselves. They say they have to keep improving so that people will want to buy the upgrades. There's built-in competition, not just between firms, but across time. The second argument is, how can there be inefficiency and scarcity if, under the early definitions, there's a price motivation? If people want it, they're going to pay for it. The argument in favor of monopolies is that if a company doesn't have to worry about being competitive, they can devote their time, money, and effort to research and development, improving their product without the time rush to beat the other guys to the market. New products will be thoroughly tested, debugged, and be a benefit to the consumer. They can afford to do this by not having to spend their money against their competition.